more. Thank you. That's better. Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Valentina Moreno. I'm the curator of multidisciplinary programs at the Koffler Center of the Arts. Thank you so much for coming here today and enduring the weather and the rain. Welcome to the Toronto Jewish Book Festival presented by the Koffler Center of the Arts. The Jewish Book Festival provides a forum for international and Canadian authors who explore contemporary Jewish life, big ideas, politics, and current affairs. Plus, we offer for sale a wide range of books of Jewish interest and themes for all ages. So I do encourage you to browse our collection if you haven't done it so yet. The Koffler Center of the Arts mission is to bring people together through arts and culture to create a more civil and global society. Artists and art enthusiasts of all kinds and from all over the world come to the Koffler to create and exhibit, perform and listen, view and debate, learn and share, and as we say at the Koffler, come early, stay late, and why not, bring your mother. We give thanks to our supporters for their loyalty and support over the years, our cultural Caesar sponsor CIBC Ruth Gandhi, our media partner the National Post, the Ontario Arts Council through the Community and Multidisciplinary Arts Organizations Program, the UGA Federation of Greater Toronto, and our many, many patrons and members. We are pleased to greet you in this beautiful venue, and an especially warm greeting to our sponsor of this evening, Canadian Friends of Hebrew University. I would like to call on Connie Putterman, a member of the board of the Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, to introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Connie Putterman, and I serve on the board of the Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, the proud sponsor of tonight's talk. Before we hear from Professor Gimbel on his recent book, I'd like to share a few thoughts on Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, what we do, and why we're here tonight. CHFU is a charitable organization that builds academic, medical, and scientific partnerships between Canada and the Hebrew University for the benefit of Israel and mankind, as part of an overall mission to raise money and awareness of Hebrew University, its programs of study, scholarship programs, and much more. Founded in 1925 by the very person we're going to hear so much about tonight, Albert Einstein, along with Sigmund Freud, Martin Buber, and Chaim Weizmann, the Hebrew University has become a central pillar behind Israel's success. It's actually been dubbed the startup of the startup nation. Consider, for example, that 40% of all civilian scientific research in Israel is conducted at the Hebrew University, and that the leading cancer and Alzheimer's treatment drugs were developed at Hebrew U. You might also be surprised to learn that the university won 7 Nobel Prizes in the last decade, produced 4 Israeli prime ministers, and yes, even invented the cherry tomato. Can you imagine a Cobb salad without cherry tomatoes? If you visit Israel, take the opportunity to visit the Hebrew University and meet some of the people there, as I most recently did. I'm personally involved as a board member in a Canadian-Israeli research initiative in autism research at the Hebrew University's Medical Research Institute, known as IMRIC. And I can tell you how rewarding it is to personally get to know the people that are doing great work there. Speaking of great work, tonight's talk is an opportunity for us to learn more about Albert Einstein, a man who embodies the very spirit and ethos of Hebrew University, and who helped found the institution nearly 100 years ago. And no better person to talk about Einstein than our esteemed author this evening, Steven Gimbel. Steven is the Edwin T. and Cynthia Shearer Johnson Professor of Distinguished Teaching in the Humanities and Chair in the Department of Philosophy at Gettysburg College, which I learned tonight is on the border of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Steve's research focuses on the connection between scientific evidence and explanation and the development of 20th century analytic philosophy. He's the author of books on science and philosophy, and will tonight be sharing thoughts on his latest book entitled Einstein's Jewish Science, Physics at the Intersection of Politics and Religion. Please join me in welcoming Steven Gimbel.
Well, goodness, thank you, everybody. Let me start by thanking the folks from the Koffler, and thank you from the Friends of Hebrew University. The four names you mentioned are really a fascinating foursome, aren't they? Einstein, Freud, Weizmann, and the fourth was Bluma. And what's interesting is that the four of these people all knew each other, right? It's no accident that the four of them are there at the founding of this institution. And so what I'll do now is actually tell this story involving those four people. I hadn't realized that's what we were going to do, but that's what we're going to do. We're going to take those four people and talk about the ways in which science came about at a particular place at a particular time, right? All four of them, right, are in either Germany or Austria at the same period, at the turn of the 20th century, right? That was the time when everything got turned upside down. Everything. And that's really what this story is about. You see, Albert Einstein was born in Germany into a secular household. Now, you know, the common discussion, well, Einstein was a completely secular Jew. Well, actually, Einstein was a very religious practicing Jew for a while, when he was 8. And then he turned 9. We'll tell that story in a little bit. But he grew up in a Germany that had anti-Semitism deep within the nature of its culture, within its laws. He grew up at a time that was really interesting and peculiar. It was really the end of a very, very long age, right? Einstein comes about at a time when things they thought had reached about as far as they could go. And you had German intellectuals, people like Gottfried Wilhelm Hegel. And what Hegel thought was that we had reached the end of history. That Germany was the pinnacle of humanity. We had gotten to the end of it all. We were there. And so there was this pride, right? There was, within the German community especially, but throughout Europe as a whole, this idea that humanity had gone farther than anyone could have imagined, and we were there. We had fully realized ourselves as human beings. Well, this led to a bit of arrogance. And arrogance, as it does, often leads to closed-mindedness. Now, Einstein's family was secular, as many Jewish households were, and his parents even sent him actually to a Catholic school, Peter Schule. And they didn't mind so much, except that there was compulsory religious education. And so that made them a little bit uneasy. So one of the things they did was they brought in an uncle, right? Every secular house has that religious uncle, right? That's the guy they brought in, basically to teach him Hebrew school one-on-one. And he was in these schools, and it was in the schools which he hated. He hated for several reasons, one of which was simply the structure of German education, right? Which was very rigorous, very memorization-oriented. He used to refer to his teachers as lieutenants, and the schoolroom as barracks, right? And from Einstein, the pacifist, this was an insult, right? And so here he was, and his teachers would look at him, and it was there in the classroom that he first experienced anti-Semitism. Now, Einstein, to his core, had problems with authority. This would happen throughout his life, but from a very young age, authority was just something that rubbed him the wrong way. Now, you know, we mentioned Freud. It's hard not to psychoanalyze. Einstein's mother was not only Jewish, she was a Jewish mother, you know. very controlling. She was in charge of the family. She was very willing to use guilt when she wasn't getting her way, especially with her son Albert. But we'll leave the psychoanalysis aside. The fact is, Einstein always had problems with authority. And so here are these teachers, right? Instantly, right, the hackles are raised. And on top of it, they're being overtly anti-Semitic to the one Jewish boy. And so if he was going to be the Jewish boy, he was going to be the Jewish boy. And so he actually becomes, as a sort of reaction, for a period of time, deeply religious. Right? He keeps kosher in a household that otherwise doesn't. Right? He would make up little psalms that he would sing to himself on the way to school. All of this ends after a period. Two things happen. One is his father and his uncle owned an electronics factory. That's how they were making their living. And he went into the factory one day and his uncle pulled him aside and showed him a compass. Nifty little thing, right? No matter which way you hold it, that little needle still points north. Most of us would think, oh, that's cool. But for Einstein, this was world-shaking. There was a force. There was an invisible force. For him, he thought in order for something to move, you had to pull it, you had to push it, you had to lift it. All of a sudden, here's this thing that was moving. It was being held by an invisible force. There's something underneath what we see that causes the world to be as it is. Now, at the same time, it was a custom among German Jews that once a week you would have a student over for dinner. These students then as now were poor and in need of home cooking. So they had a medical student named Max Talmy who would visit the family once a week. Now, you're visiting, right? You don't have much. You're a poor student. You want to, get in well with the family. What do? You play nice with the kids, right? And so what does he do? He starts bringing books, popular science books for kids, to Einstein. And he starts reading these books. And after the compass, all of a sudden, there it is. Especially a book on geometry. He gave him a textbook on geometry. And the idea that suddenly you could think perfectly rationally in deductive steps to absolute certainty that told you how things had to be, this was just stunning. So suddenly we have this mind that develops. It's a mind that develops in a number of ways. And here's where we can start pulling in our other figures, right? He and Freud, who we'll come back to later because it's fun to talk about Sigmund Freud. I don't just say that because of my mother. Thank you. He and Freud were both pacifists. Outspoken ones at a time when that was not a very popular opinion. Right? He and Freud both were outspoken opponents of war. Now, you got to remember that the country of Germany is actually very young compared to other nations, right? I mean, Bismarck only unifies Germany a few years before Einstein himself is born. So Einstein is born into a young country. Now, think about any relationship when it first starts up, right? There's always that period of just passion, right? It's very hot. And it's the same way politically, right? That when you have this unification, it creates this wave of nationalistic passion. And so you had, under Kaiser Wilhelm, regular military parades, right? The Kaiser saying that German militarism is identical with German identity. And so here you have Einstein, who's automatically an outsider in part because he's Jewish, with these deep anti-militaristic feelings, seeing all around him this wave of nationalism tied to military action. And it makes him deeply uneasy. So uneasy that it leads him to leave. Now, the story here is kind of funny. Einstein's father and uncle owned this company making electrical appliances. Now, parts for them. There was also another company in Germany doing that, a company called Siemens. Now, not only was Siemens a very large and powerful company, but the Kaiser's daughter married the son of Mr. Siemens. Yeah. So very quickly, the Einstein brothers, not the bagel company, but the electrical company, was run out of business. And so they thought, okay, Germany's not going to work for us, but clearly this electrical thing is the wave of the future, so they relocated to Italy. Now, Einstein was just about to start his senior year of high school, so his family said, you will stay here, finish school, and then go to college. We'll be in Italy. Now, Einstein hates Germany. He hates the schools. He's Einstein. There's got to be a way out of this. So he gets his family physician to write him a letter saying, Albert is suffering from nervous exhaustion. Please excuse him from the rest of the school year. And so he makes his way to Italy and unannounced shows up at his parents' house. Now you can imagine the reception. It wasn't a happy one. What are you doing here? Why aren't you finishing? I got an idea. Okay, look, Dad, listen to me, Pops. I got an idea. Okay? You see, now you need a high school diploma, then you take some entrance exams, right? Standardized tests, and then you apply. At this point, you go to a university you want to go to, and you simply take the entrance exam. You didn't actually need a credential saying you had graduated high school. He said, I'm going to go to the Technical University in Zurich. It's a great school. I'm just going to go. I will take the entrance exam. I don't need to finish this year. I'll spend the year studying in Italy with a bicycle. Hey, he didn't study very much. So he takes the exam. He fails. Close. They didn't. I got an idea. Let's admit, Pops, I got an idea. No ideas. He's sent to a boarding school in Switzerland to finish his high school education. Now, this school was a very progressive school. This school had a new science lab. This school had teachers who really worked with you. And here, he fell in love with learning, with science, and with the daughter of the family he was staying with. It didn't work out. But he completes the year. He takes the exam. He gets into the university. And there, Einstein takes courses. Sort of. Again, Einstein has a problem with authority. Professors, we're authorities. We wear coats. Yeah, Einstein doesn't go to class very much. You know, the myth is Einstein failed math. No, Einstein didn't fail math. Einstein was actually quite good at math for a physicist. If you talk to mathematicians, you make that distinction, and we'll see one who did in a bit, right? But Einstein does well enough to get through, but he has problems with his advisor. The head of the physics department was a man named Weber, and he was the authority. So he and Einstein butted heads, right? As a result, Einstein can't get a job after college. He applies to literally every single physicist in all of Europe. None of them take him. Why? Well, look. The Technical University in Zurich, the initials are ETH, and if you're going to get somebody from the ETH working in your lab, first thing you would do is go to Weber and say, okay, tell me about the kid. And Weber couldn't stand Einstein. So he ends up with no job. Boy. But he has a friend, a dear friend, a man named Marcel Grossmann. And Grossmann was his guardian angel. Grossmann went to class, took good notes, shared his notes with Einstein, helped Einstein pass. He also had a father who was connected with the civil service in Switzerland. He gets him a job in Bram as a patent clerk, which was a great job for him. Because what do you do if you're a patent clerk? You have to take these things that are, proposed as new inventions, and you have to figure out how they work and then see whether anyone has thought of it before. So, you walk by a desk, what is the person doing? Well, they're scribbling things like mathematical equations and little diagrams, Einstein would get in early, do an entire day's work in the morning, and then spend his afternoon at work doing his own physics. And if anybody walked by, it looked like he was working. Brilliant. And during this time, he comes up with this theory of relativity that we'll talk about in detail in a little bit. But it's a theory that radically changes the way we see the world. It is the theory that would make him Einstein. Now, he's visited in Einstein by a man named Max Planck, who was probably the most famous and most important living physicist at the time. Planck was the first person to realize how ground-shaking Einstein's work was. And so he wanted to meet this Professor Einstein, who, he's Max Planck, he knew everybody. He knew, who is this? So all of Einstein's papers were signed Bern, Switzerland. So what does Planck do? He does what any reasonable person would do. He goes to the University of Bern, goes to the physics department and says, "Where's Professor Einstein?" They say, "Who?" "Professor Einstein." "Well, who's writing these papers?" "What papers?" "No one heard of him." He looks him up in the phone book. That's how he finds him. And he goes and he meets with Einstein and he realizes that, yeah, this guy's doing exactly what he thinks he's doing. He's changing everything. Now, Planck, right? Planck is a dear friend of Einstein's who is the photographic negative of Einstein. Okay? Planck loved German education. Okay? Planck would work at a banker's desk. A high desk with no chair. Sitting made you weak. Planck had his day scheduled to the minute. He had his piano practice scheduled to the minute. He had his daily walk scheduled to the minute. Yeah, they were different people, but they admired each other greatly. And it was Planck who would bring Einstein back. See, when he left Germany to go to Italy to meet his parents, he renounced his citizenship. For a long time, Einstein was literally a man without a country. He was not going to be a German citizen. Planck, meanwhile, at the University of Berlin, had built the finest physics department in the world. People that Einstein knew and liked and respected. And Planck said, "Come on, I got a place for you." He didn't want to go back to Germany. But look at that department. And then Planck said, "You won't have to do any teaching. I'm there." So he went. Against his earlier judgment, he returns to Germany right before World War I, which was the horror that he foresaw. He thought this militarism is just dangerous. This could go to a very, very bad place, and it did. Now, World War I is an event that I think we often forget about, in part because of the absolute horrors of World War II and because of the development of nuclear weapons that came out of it. But World War I was really a tragedy unparalleled, right? I mean, trench warfare, chemical weapons, right? I mean, you had these trenches literally dug, one here, one there, armed, mechanized weapons, one side charging, gun down. The next day, this side charging, gun down. So you've got nothing but mass carnage, and months go by, you're still in the same trench. Nothing has changed. Death for the sake of death. And all of this from a Europe that thought it was the pinnacle of humanity. We were as far as humans could go. And look what we've done to each other. Look what we've done to ourselves. And so as a result of that, we had no choice but to look back in at ourselves. What did we just do? And so at that time, you get this radical upheaval. Everything gets turned on its head because the way we thought it had to be, it couldn't be that way. And so art starts questioning what is art. Science begins to look at its foundational concept, and they begin to change. Architecture, music, everything, politics. There are no concepts after this horrible tragedy that are left unchallenged. And so you get all of these new movements, what we call modernism. And who is at the forefront of virtually all of them? Jews. Yes, Jews. Right? Atonal music. Jews. Right? Schoenberg. Right? Dadaist art. Zara. Right? Everywhere you look, Jews. Now, to the German conservative, right? You got to remember, everyone else in Europe had their turn. Everyone else had been the great dominant power, right? The French, the British, right? The Portuguese, the Turks. This was their time. And suddenly, the rules were changed. And who was it there helping to change the rules? The Jews. And so all of this modernism was seen as Jewish. See, the word Jewish had multiple meanings, right? It not only meant what we usually think of it in terms of a Jewish community or Jewish religion. It meant liberal. It meant modernist. It meant a lot of things that were deeply politically loaded. And so, you have Einstein, who is this strange man. Right after World War I, there's suddenly a confirmation of this theory of relativity of his that gives him tremendous power. He becomes the first scientific superstar. He's a celebrity who also very loudly argued against the war at a time of great warfare. Right? What happens after the war? Well, the establishment of the Weimar Republic, led by the party associated with Albert Einstein. He becomes a public figure, a political figure. We think of Einstein as sort of this, grandfatherly, gentle clown. He was very political, especially in Germany at the time. And when he gave speeches, he would use what we now call dog whistle politics. He would use phrases that he knew would anger political nationalists in Germany. He was unabashedly opposed to the nationalists that would give rise to Nazism. And so they looked at him in the same way that, say, Jane Fonda or Michael Moore would be looked at in the States. He was a political figure. And you had the Weimar Republic, right? Which rolled back a number of the anti-Semitic laws. Put Jews in prominent places in the government, ministers. And so you had what was seen as, right, rolling back traditional German values, replacing them with these Jews. And here was Einstein, right? The symbol of it all. And then, of course, you know what happened to the economy. It tanks, right? Hyperinflation. Everyone lost everything, including Einstein, who had just gotten divorced with 2 kids and needed money and was very famous. You need money, you're famous, what do? You go to Toronto and you give a talk. Right? But in his case, it wasn't Toronto. He went to Paris. He went to New York. He went to England. He went to all of these places to give lectures where he was handsomely paid. All of these countries just happened to have been the enemy during World War I. So here are the German nationalists who, they were convinced they didn't lose World War I. Right? How do you lose a war when somebody else invades and takes over? Nobody invaded Germany. We were still in control. So if they didn't invade us, we couldn't have lost the war. But if we did lose it, it was because of those liberal socialists and communists. Everyone on the left, they were just, insufficiently patriotic. And here was Einstein. And what was he doing? He was sailing on ships under the British flag, under the French flag, going to the U.S., in part to raise money for himself, in part to raise money for the Hebrew University. Who went to Columbia University with him? Chaim Weizmann. I told you I'd get all these four. Trust me, they're all going to come up. So he and Weizmann go to the U.S. to raise money for the founding of Hebrew U. And so that Einstein can support his kids. So here he is, sailing under the flag of the enemy, being treated as the good German, the rehabilitated German, which only angered them more. And so, they needed to get rid of Einstein. Einstein's power was this theory, this weird theory. And so if we could undermine the theory, we could undermine Einstein. We could get it back to normalcy. We could get it back to where we were, where we should be. Einstein challenged everything. Okay? His theory, I mean, it's funny. You know, the special theory of relativity comes out in 1905. 107 years ago. Still we think, oh my God, it's Einstein. That's complicated. I can't understand that. Think of the technology from 107 years ago. Right? Oh, how simplistic. But yet somehow Einstein, it's easy. Let me show you. Here's a glass. Two concepts. Covariance and invariance. Okay. Is the glass to the left or right of my hand? This is the easy question. We'll get on. It is?
Well, you're right, or...
Ah, okay. You hold on. We'll get to you. Right? You're going to say it's...
Right, left.
Left is the one with the L. You're going to say it's...
You're right.
From your point of view, it is to the...
Left.
Left. Thank you. And I will say, no, see, it's to the right. Now, notice the difference between relativity and relativism. Relativism is just, everyone's truth is her truth, or his truth, or my truth, or your truth. No. If you're sitting there and somebody said, the glass is to the right of the hand, that person doesn't know right and left, right? There is a fact of the matter from where you're sitting. There's a fact of the matter from where I'm sitting. But that fact of the matter depends on where you're sitting. That's relativity. Now, is the glass between the hands? Yes. Doesn't matter where you're sitting. This is an invariant fact. This is a covariant fact. Covariant facts change with your position. Invariant facts change not at all. That's why we call them invariant. Okay, so far so good?
Yes.
Every scientific theory has a set of invariants, has a set of things that it thinks are real, don't change, are absolute. Now Newton, who had the theory of motion before Einstein, said that things like length was an invariant. Right? So, how long would you say this book is?
6 inches.
Actually, it's 237 pages. Okay, it's 7 inches, right? So it should be 7 inches no matter how I'm moving, right? And I apologize for going out of your frame, right? No matter how I'm moving, it should be 7 inches. It's just 7 inches moving, right? Time, right? So if we synchronize our watches, pretend we have, oh, we actually have one. Well done. So if we synchronize our watches, right? A second is a second, right? When I'm moving, that second should still be a second, right? Time, length, these things are invariant. Mass, of which some of us have a little bit too much, right? But it's an invariant. It's a fact of the world. Deny it however we will, right? So the idea here, according to Newton, are these things are universal facts. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're looking from, what your state of motion is. These things are invariant. What Einstein does is take the invariants and make them covariant. So according to Einstein, when I'm moving, with respect to you, this book shrinks in the direction of motion. Now, for me, right, that book is stationary with respect to me, so I still see it as the 7 inches. But as I move 3/4 of the speed of light down this aisle, you see it as 4 inches. Well, which one of us is right? Right? It's like to the left of or to the right of. It's just a matter of perspective, right? Or similarly, right? Our watches, they should remain the same, right? But as I move faster, time, duration, stretch out. Now for me, it'll still be at the same second. But for you, who sees me moving, you know, if my watch emitted clicks, you would measure much longer clicks or much longer time durations between the clicks. Similarly with mass. The faster you go, the heavier something is. This is why nothing can go faster than the speed of light. It's not an engineering problem, we just haven't figured it out yet. No. The faster you go, the heavier something gets. As it approaches the speed of light, its mass approaches an infinite amount. Now, here's something I do when I teach this in the classroom, is I'll take a chair, and I'll push it. And I'll say, look, certain amount of force, what happens? It accelerates, right? It goes faster. And then I have a student, usually a petite student, sit in the chair. And I say, look, I'll give the same force. What happens? Right? Less acceleration. I say, and then I'll pick a larger person and say, please, sit on, usually it's him sitting on her lap. And there's, uncomfortable moments. And, say, now what happens when I push the chair with the same amount of force? I get a hernia. Right? So the idea here is that the more the mass, right, the more force you need to accelerate it. So if something has an infinite mass, how much force will you need to make it go faster? An infinite amount. You can't have an infinite amount of energy to generate that infinite force. And since mass increases the faster you go, that's why something can't go faster than the speed of light. It can't. Show you how much of a nerd I was in college. We attached a digital meter to my buddy's car, hooked it up to the speedometer that showed how much heavier the car was as we were going down the road. So it actually showed the factor. Yeah, we had a lot of Friday nights to figure out how to make it work because we weren't getting dates. We'll go back to Freud in a moment. So Einstein has this revolutionary picture that changes the way we look at space, at time, at motion. Had to be wrong. It's weird. It has these counterintuitive ideas. It's wrong. And not only is it wrong, it's Jewish. Right? There's a group of scientists, and these aren't flakes. Two of the leading proponents are Nobel Prize winners who say, look, there is real science, Aryan science, authentic science, and then there's Jewish science, flawed science. And what's the difference? German science, Aryan science, the science of Nordic peoples is done the proper way. Slow and careful observation. And once you've made those observations, you then have insight into the world mystery and how it organizes it all. And how did these two guys win their Nobel Prizes? For painstaking observations that led to discovery of new phenomena. Jewish science. Jewish science is this weird stuff that relies on manipulating symbols, on reinterpreting things. Reinterpreting symbols. Who does that? Well, there is a reason they call us the people of the book. Right? I mean, in a sense, they're right. Now, when you work out the way that they make this distinction, it turns out to be ideological nonsense. But there's an interesting thing that happens here. What Einstein does is to rethink certain concepts and see them in a really interesting way. Right? Now, go back to these ideas we had of invariance and covariance. Right? For Newton, all of the things we saw, all of the things we could measure had to be invariant. They had to be real because they were measurable. Right? I could do this in this room, right? I can't tell you how tall Santa Claus is because there is no Santa Claus to have a height. in a room full of goyim, you get these down-fallen faces. Right? So the idea here is, right, if there's a thing to measure, the measurement must reflect some reality. And so length, time, mass, these things must be invariant. And what Einstein does is come up with a set of equations that shows, no, it turns out it's covariant. Now, a teacher of his, a Russian Jew named Hermann Minkowski, who was his teacher in college. One of the teachers whose classes Einstein skipped regularly. Minkowski was a genius. I mean, of the first class, he dies incredibly young. His father was a Russian merchant, and the family went broke before leaving Russia and moving to Königsberg, which is now called Kaliningrad, which is in a little part of Russia that's actually not connected to the rest of Russia. It's called East Russia. It's right on the Black Sea. It's a port that they need. It's just next to Lithuania. It used to be part of Germany called East Prussia. The Russians got rid of the P. And so his family leaves Russia, moves to this place. He memorizes the works of Goethe in case his family ever goes broke and he's without books again. That's how brilliant this man is.
Wow.
He also was incredibly shy. Teachers have to give lectures. Shy people don't lecture well. And so he spoke very softly and he mumbled. He was just very nervous, and so Einstein just thought, this is useless, I'm not going. I'm going to go get coffee. Just what he did a lot. And so when Einstein's theory came out and Minkowski reads it, he thought, oh my goodness, there's another physicist by the name of Albert Einstein. And he literally says, I never thought him capable of this. But what Minkowski, who was not only a physicist, but a master mathematician, did was realize what Einstein... Now, Einstein knew what he was doing. Minkowski realized what he had done. It was Minkowski who put the theory fully in terms of covariance and invariance. And what Minkowski did was show that what Einstein was describing was a four-dimensional universe. That there is a reality. There are objective truths, right? Now, those snaps occurred a distance apart and a time apart. Now, depending upon your state of motion, you will measure different times and different distances. But what Minkowski realized is that there's a way to put the time and the distance together to form a four-dimensional measure that will be the same for everyone. There is an invariant. It's just an invariant we never see. We have to construct it from the things we see. So there is a reality, but that reality instantiates itself differently according to your frame of reference. Ooh, where do we see that concept? That there is an absolute truth, but that absolute truth changes depending upon the circumstances. Well, this entire project actually started when a buddy of mine, Steven Stern, who's a professor of Judaic studies, came into my office complaining that, well, we talk about ethics, we always talk about Kant and Mill and all these people coming out of the Christian tradition. We never talk about Jewish ethics, which has a very different approach, right? There are halachic laws. There are laws that are absolute truths, but how do you instantiate it? Well, it depends on the situation, right? Do not steal. Absolute truth. Now, I find a $20 bill. I pick it up, and your money is beautiful, by the way. I pick it up and I put it in my pocket. Did I just steal?
Wow.
Exactly. That's the right answer. If I'm in my friend's house, yes. If I'm in a library, maybe. If I'm in a crowded parking lot, no. Right? I mean, what the rabbis say is, if You can't identify an owner, and if the owner has no reasonable expectation of finding his lost object again, then you can keep it. So is it stealing? It depends. Now, are there absolute truths? Yes, there are absolute truths. But those absolute truths will be seen differently from different perspectives. Right? When rabbis undergo Talmudic training, what do? You always have a partner. You sit down, you discuss a passage. He takes one perspective, you take another, you argue. And then you switch. Why? Because there is an absolute truth. But we don't see it from our limited perspective. Right? What our perspective does is give us some angle, which gives us a part of the truth. But it's by seeing it from another perspective that we see a broader sense of what is true, of what is real. And so notice what we have here. Now, I could not say that Einstein was influenced by Koffler or Koffler. Right? We know what he was reading. We know the physicists he was studying. Right? The Dutch physicist H.A. Lorentz, the German physicist and philosopher Ernst Mach, the Frenchman Henri Poincaré. None of them Jewish. But the way he's thinking, and we see it not just in the theory of relativity, we see it over and over again in so many of his theories, has this same picture, this same method, this same model. Now, it's a model that is, in certain ways, clearly Jewish. Now, are you going to see it in all Jewish thinkers? No. Right? Writing at the same time was Freud. Right? Now, Freud. Right? Freud's theory of psychoanalysis gives us an interesting situation. Right? We have a spatial relationship. For Freud, there are two people. There's the patient, who is lying on a couch. And then we have the analyst, who is sitting behind him. And that's important. This person doesn't see this person. And you don't hear him very often. So tell me about your childhood. And then you have this person, right? Now, Freud's theory of mind, right? You have the ego, right? That's the part of your mind that is your consciousness. You have the id, right? The part that's connected with your deeper, baser passions. And you have your superego, right? Which is, if you have the angel and the devil sitting on the shoulders, right? This is the higher self, right? But what really motivates you to act is often subconscious, right? The picture is the iceberg, right? Where you have just the tip showing, but there's so much more underneath of it. Or if it's Jewish, it would be like Greenberg, right? But this person, he's laying here. He's talking about his personal history. All he sees is his memories. All he sees is this tip of the iceberg. The analyst back here has access now, through Freud's theory, he argues, to the whole iceberg. Right? He gets to the underneath, so I guess we could say it's Jewish, he cuts off the tip. Right? He sees this entire iceberg, what's below the surface. And so in certain ways, Freud, his thinking is much more Christian. There is an absolute truth, and you just need to occupy the proper godlike position from which to see it. So Freud, in this way, wouldn't be a Jewish thinker. Right? But Einstein gives us this theory that is. And it's a notion that leads him to various social and political positions. In a country that is in chaos and only getting worse. Now, it's at this point that he begins having dinners with a dear friend of his, Martin Buber. Told you I'd get all for it. He and Buber were dear friends. They were both Zionists of the same sort. They were what we would now call one-staters. Right? They were both people who had deep concerns about nationalism, and while anti-Semitism led them to think we need a safe place, the idea that it would be a national place, the nationalistic element and the militaristic element worried both of them deeply. But now here's Einstein, who at this point is openly saying, I am a Jew, but at the same time is clearly not an observant practicing Jew. And here he is having dinner with his dear friend, Martin Buber. Right? Yeah, he's kind of religious. And so the question then enters Einstein's mind. What makes us us? And he gives an interesting paper called, Is There a Jewish Point of View? Right? Now this would be odd coming from someone who is accused of having a Jewish science. And here he is asking exactly that question. And he answers, yeah, actually there is. He looks across that table at Martin Buber and says, there is something that makes us us. What is it? What is it that unites the German Jew with the Eastern European Jew? With the Jew from North Africa? What is it that unites us, secular modernists, to Buber, who is leading this charge back to a sort of anti-rationalist position, right? Embrace the old superstitions. That's where we come from. That's who we are. So in deep ways, Einstein's project and Buber's project were the exact opposite. So what was it? And Einstein says there are two things. There are two defining characteristics. One is a sense of awe when you look at the universe. Right? You look at, right, the writings of the Chassids, right? There is this joy and this wonderment at the heart of it. Einstein says, that's exactly what I have. That's exactly what leads me to do my science. And the second is a notion of empathy as a basic sense of relationship to the other. That I see the other as a person like me. And of course, Buber is writing I and thou. And so these two things, Einstein says, are really the heart of Judaism. Now, of course, there are lots of empathetic, awe-filled people. And in a sense, that makes so many of us Jewish. But what Einstein really thought he was doing, in line with all four of these figures who were there at the founding of Hebrew University, was doing something that in this non-standard way, and everything Einstein did, he twisted into something non-standard, was indeed Jewish science. And so even though this claim, this phrase, comes from these Nazi thinkers, what I want to argue is that there's a way that we can reinterpret it. That, like Einstein and the rabbis, we can refocus it. We can look at it from another angle that robs it of its hateful background and use it to undergird our pride in who he was and who we are. And so that's what I talk about. Thank you very much. And I would be glad to take any questions.
Thank you so much. This was so enlightening. It was a pleasure to be here. Although we're only a few, I think we feel all very, very lucky to be here listening to you tonight. Questions? I'm just going to ask to use the microphone so that we can all hear.
Yeah, it's a small
Just
group.
because we are recording.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Did this feeling of awe, would Einstein, or his people who interpret him, think he had a belief in God, or did he ever define his belief in God, or just leave it as this feeling of awe, or there's some greater thing in the universe?
Einstein actually speaks a lot and writes a lot about God. and he uses the term religion in 3 different ways. The first is to refer to organized religion, which he explicitly distances himself from. He says, I do not believe in the God of Abraham. The second way he uses the term religion is in what philosophers call the fact-value distinction. He thinks there's a difference between descriptive sentences, that is a chair, the book is 7 inches long, statements about the way things are, and ought sentences, right? Sentences about morality, what you should do. Is and ought are different, and he often uses the word religion to cover ought sentences. Now, he doesn't in any way think that means that there is some supernatural foundation for ethics. He actually bases it on this notion of empathy, very much in the world. But the third way he uses the term religion is to refer to what he calls his cosmic religion. And this is a view he sketches out. One of the people that he really most loved in history was a Jewish philosopher named Baruch Spinoza. And he says very clearly when a rabbi asked him, do you believe in God? He responds in a telegram which ends up getting published in the New York Times. And, Einstein at one point said he has a version of the Midas touch where everything he says turns to newsprint. He says to this rabbi, I believe in Spinoza's God. And the idea here is Spinoza was someone, if you look at Spinoza's big book called The Ethics, it looks like a geometry textbook. There are axioms and there are theorems, and he tries to prove them deductively in this very clean way. And he thinks that the universe works according to absolute necessity. What happens must happen. And this is what got Spinoza in big trouble, is that even God is bound by necessity. God has to do what God has to do because of God's very nature, so there is no will. Whoa. This didn't sit well with the rabbis of Amsterdam, and Baruch Spinoza becomes Benedictine Spinoza. But the idea being that there is, he thinks, an organization, a structure, a logical structure to the world. So for Einstein, his notion of God is the ultimate physics textbook, which is governing the world. So he doesn't see it as an intelligence separate from the world, but rather as an order inherent within the world. And so what we do when we're doing physics really is, in a sense you can think of him almost as a pantheist, that God is the structure of the universe. And that there is a deep reverence in doing physics because it is uncovering this deep essence of being. So the answer is complicated, but he goes to great lengths to describe this way in which he thinks, the world is ordered, and that order is the divine.
Any more questions?
I'm not sure if I got my question quite clear in my head, but wasn't Judaism itself evolving through this process?
Yes.
I understand from a lecture I heard recently, many people will know, at least Rabbi Goldstein, talks about Reform Judaism coming out of this rational movement.
Yes.
Was Einstein, or not Einstein, yeah, Einstein involved in any way in that?
Okay, Einstein is clearly around at this point. You're right. This is the time and this is the place where Judaism itself is changing, right? And so you get, this notion of modernism, which was very, very attractive to Jews, in part because it's tied to democratic principles. It's tied to this notion of equality, of rights. And so a lot of Jews were very quick to latch onto modernist notions because what it did was it offered us a chance to say, look, we're just like you, right? Everyone is equal. It leads us to the ability, right, to have jobs we otherwise couldn't have, to have political power we otherwise couldn't have. And so there is this movement to be modern. Along with it comes education. Right? There were only certain jobs you could have. This is why, when you think of, a Jewish mother, right? The old joke in the States is that, we elect the first Jewish president, right? And he calls his mother and says, "Ma, I want you to come to the inauguration." It's up there in Washington, I'm in Florida, it's cold, it's January, I don't know. It's like, I'll get you a nice warm coat. I don't know, it's so far, I'll have Air Force One pick you up. Come on, please. All right, I'll go. So there she is, sitting there. He's taking the oath of office, his hand in the air. She turns to the person next to him and says, you see that man up there with his hand up? His brother's a doctor. Okay? Now, the idea being that doctor, lawyer, that these were the few occupations that Jews could have. Right? You could be a professor, but not too high. And so education, stemming from traditional reverence for the scholar, but also political limitations, led to certain occupations that led to a picture of science as liberation. Now, in the countryside, you still have very much the old ways. And so you get this schism in the Jewish community between the modernists who want to be scientific, who want to be modern, who want to assert themselves into the culture and still be Jewish, and who look at these ways and say, well, we just need to update them. We just need to restructure them. We just need to reform them. And if we reform them in line with these modern pictures, then we'll have a new Judaism that will stand the test of time because it will evolve. Well, of course, that got pushback from those who say, if you change anything, you've abandoned. And that's where the Orthodox came from. Right? You have those in the middle saying, well, we'll believe this, but we'll still act like that. And that was the roots of the historical school of what became conservative Judaism. And this is very much a question that is live. Because there is at this time, when Einstein is giving this talk that's trying to formulate what is Judaism, this is a live question. Both in the community and outside, right? The Nazis actually have to take 3 stabs at defining Judaism for interesting political reasons. But Jews themselves are trying to figure out what does it mean to be Jewish in this new changing world. And yeah, Einstein is very much a part of that because he's not a Reformed Jew in the sense of belonging to a Reformed congregation, but he is part of this modernist movement that still claims Jewish identity. And this is what's happening at Buber's dinner table, is that you have Buber, who is very much going back to this stuff, right? We need to go back to the old ways. We need to embrace the Eastern European village Jew. We need to embrace our old superstitions, right? That's what authentic Judaism is, right? He's very much, in a certain sense, reacting against modernism. And here you have these two people who mutually respect each other, like each other deeply, but who have these radically different pictures. And so Einstein is caught very much in the middle of this question of Jewish identity, which was, at this period in Germany, very much an open, live, and very scary question. Right? If you really do fear the annihilation of your people, being able to figure out what holds us together seems a pressing problem. And so this notion, you have sociology actually is born at this time because you have communities turning into societies. And so this question of what makes, are Jews even a community? If some live here and others live there, are they part of the same community? Is it, it's clearly not just a religion because you have such different beliefs throughout. Others say, well, it's a nation, which is a vague term. And so this was a live question, exactly as you point out. And yeah, Einstein is deeply worried, as most people within the Jewish community were. And I think that is one sense in which he does. There's a wonderful quotation where he says, you can tell Jews, not just from their appearance, but from their intellectual work. So in a certain sense, Einstein himself says what he's doing is Jewish science. But then he needs to figure out how. And that was a question he wrestled with.
Is this on? Okay. I remember learning in my psychology class last year, as we were talking about creativity, and I think it was Picasso, I'm not sure, but I know Picasso's not Jewish, but there is the Bohr-Rutherford diagram, and we were talking about the correlation between science and artistic creativity and scientific creativity and how they benefited from each other. And I was like, as we were talking, I was like, this concept, I just had like this picture in my head about cubism and the four other diagrams.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking, and I remember my professor telling us about how there would be like these rooms, like a kitchen table. There would be a mathematician, there would be a theologian, there would be a scientist, and there would be like all these different sorts of people that would just talk about everything, and but it would feed off of each other. All these different fields would feed off of each other, and the diversity of the knowledge background would help feed new ideas. And I was wondering if like Einstein ever had like colleagues in other areas of like science and math and religion and art and that sort of thing, because I know that was really popular around that time in various areas in Europe.
Yes. Well, let me answer it in two ways. First, let me start with Picasso. Arthur I. Miller, not Arthur Miller, the playwright, but this is a different Arthur Miller, who now has to use his middle initial, is one of the finest historians of science of this period. And he's got a book called Einstein Picasso, where he looks at what you see in 1905, at exactly the same time when Einstein is developing the theory of special relativity, Picasso is painting Guernica. He is coming up with the notions behind Cubism. And what's fascinating, and this is what Miller points out, is that what is sitting underneath of Cubism is exactly this notion of reality as four-dimensional that you get out of Einstein. What is Cubism trying to do, right? I mean, Picasso, you look, it's like, okay, you've got a nose coming out of an ear and an elbow coming out of a mouth. What's going on? Well, what he was trying to do, right? I mean, we've had perspective since the Renaissance, right? The idea of perspective was you take a two-dimensional surface and you paint to bring out a third dimension. Wow. What Picasso was trying to do was use a two-dimensional surface to take a four-dimensional view. What he was trying to do was say, well, if I look at this table, right? A table with a pitcher and a half-full glass and an empty glass, right? Which seems sort of philosophical in some sort of way. And I look at it from this point of view, and I look at it from this point of view, and I look at it from this point of view, and I even look at it from this point of view, right? And then I take all of those views, and I match them, and I put them there. What I get is a four-dimensional picture painted in a two-dimensional surface. So really what you are seeing, you're right, in Picasso, is very much akin to what we're seeing in the thought process of Einstein. So, is there a connection between the two? Yes. So, that will be the first part of the answer. The second part asks about his relations to others and an intellectual community. And Einstein has several. He formed with a group of friends a thing called the Olympia Academy, right, which was intentionally named to sound arrogant. And they would read physics, but they would also read philosophy. They read David Hume, they read other works. They would read a wide range of things and then bat around these ideas. And it was from the people in those groups that the initial thought. See, when you think back to, we were talking about the book shrinking and the time stretching. The shrinking part was actually discovered, well, the equation was written down before Einstein by a man named H.A. Lorentz, I mentioned earlier. Now Lorentz was trying to solve this weird physics problem that no one could answer. And he said, well, let's just work at the mathematics and see what comes out. And he says, well, it's as if it shrinks in the direction of motion. I'm not saying it does, that would be weird. It's as if it shrinks in the direction of motion. What Einstein does is say, it's not as if, it does. But what we get from Lorentz are three equations. One equation for motion in this direction, and this direction. So it's just a space thing. Einstein, after one of these meetings with his friends, is walking home. He gets off the streetcar, and he wants to see what time it is, and he looks around, Bern, Switzerland, like every European town, has a clock tower. And he sees what time it is. And there it is. He's not seeing what time it is. He's seeing what time it was when the light bounced off that clock. And now as he's walking away, it's taking longer to get to him. We need not only the 3 equations that Lorentz gives, we need a 4th one that accounts for time. And once we account for time, it has to be figured back into these spatial equations. The next thing you know, you've got relativity. So, yes, there was this communal group that gave rise to these ideas. Now on top of it, Einstein said if he wasn't a physicist, he would have been a violin player. He loved music, adored music. And so the arts were clearly a part of his life. He's clearly having conversations with intellectuals of all sorts. There was one, and let me mention it because you're right, the notion of a salon was very prominent in Europe, but especially Germany at this time. And there was one man named Oppenheim, Paul Oppenheim, who ran, he was a chemist. He married a wealthy Belgian Jewish woman who fancied herself a society type, who found herself married to a chemist. And so she thought, okay, if I can't be the center of the social circle, I will be the center of the intellectual social circle. And the Oppenheims would have every Saturday a lunch. Around the table, the greatest intellectuals of all of Germany. Einstein was a regular visitor, as were Kurt Gödel, all of the big names, and ranged across the field. So, yeah, Einstein was clearly a part of that. Now, I actually got to interview Oppenheim's son. They escaped. Ended up in New Jersey because that's where Einstein was. Paul Oppenheim was one of the people who scattered Einstein's ashes. His son was 94. He was a retired political science professor at the University of Massachusetts. And we were talking, he said, Einstein was actually at my wedding. Einstein was at your wedding? And he tells the story. And so I asked what seemed like an innocent question. I said, what did Einstein give you for a wedding present? And his eyes sparkled. He goes, come here. And he jumped up, 94 years old, jumps up. He goes, come here. And we walked through his house. We were outside on the porch at this time. We go through his house to his library. And there is a book stand, sort of about this height, with a dictionary on it. He says, this is what Albert Einstein gave me. And he flips to the front cover. And there are 4 lines, rhyming couplets in German about love and life. Signed, A. Einstein. And once you've seen it, there's no doubt that. It's like, oh my goodness. And he goes, come here. And he takes me to his living room and he gets down. There's a big bookcase. He pulls out a children's book. And he flips it open to the inside cover. And there are 4 little drawings of an older man, about this, bigger woman, and then little children. Each one are labeled. It says, this book was a gift from Einstein. He drew my family in it. So, yeah, the answer is he definitely was part of that community, and there's no doubt that that sort of intellectual richness that you get from conversation played a part in making Einstein who he was.
Any other questions?
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, you mentioned Freud in passing and then sort of put it aside, and because you seem to know all these people personally, I love it. Can you tell us more about Freud and Einstein, and also when you said they were antithetical, I was surprised. Probably I was surprised because I thought that the Germans came to hate Freud.
They did. They disliked Freud very, very much because, part of what Freud does, in a certain sense, is exactly what Einstein does. He takes a notion that we thought was nailed down, and he just turns it on its head, right? Where Einstein does it for space, time, and motion, Freud does it with personhood, right? The traditional, German intellectual notion is that there is this sense of Geist, of spirit, which is connected in these deep ways to some central spirit. right? And what Freud does is, in a certain sense, turn us into individuals. Freud creates the modern individual in a deep and interesting way by saying that, look, there are, certain stages we're supposed to go through, and what happens is, if those stages don't go exactly as planned, there are ramifications. There are markers that are left in the mind, and those markers end up playing havoc later in life, leading you to do things that you otherwise wouldn't expect yourself to do, right? So for Freud, there's this notion of the subconscious, that we aren't who we think we are, that we are something else, something invisible, which, yeah, clearly created deep problems. So, in a certain sense, you're absolutely right, that both of these figures were seen as Jewish in this way, in that they took what seemed to be an obvious, simple, clear notion and turned it into one of these strange, bizarre, overly complex, overly intellectualized pictures. So in that sense, there's clearly a similarity. Socially and politically, if you look at their biographies, they're actually very, very similar. Freud also says, I am a Jew, not because I believe in the God of Abraham. And if you look at his writings on religion, and Freud actually writes about religion quite deeply, he says, I am a Jew because the anti-Semites say I am. In the same way that Einstein reacted against this. And just as Einstein found it in the schools, Freud says the first time I ever found it was in the universities, where they said I was supposed to be like this. I didn't see I was like that, but okay, you know what? If you think I'm different. And so, in a certain sense, the two of them shared, they both came from secular households who, grafted a Jewish identity onto a sort of social identity. But if you look at their scientific work, I think there are these deep differences that you find. Now, if you want to understand Freud's work deeper, there's a scholar named Daniel Boyarin, B-O-Y-A-R-I-N, who is a gay Orthodox Talmudic scholar at Berkeley. Of course, he'd be at Berkeley. And he's written a fascinating book called Unheroic Conduct, Heterosexuality and the Birth of the Jewish Man. I think it's something like that. And in it, he talks in great depth about Freud and Herzl. And both of them, he says, were responsible for creating what he says are what he terms muscle Jews. And if you read Freud's autobiography, one of the real episodes that forms his being was a story told to him by his father. His father, he said, was a very quiet man. But he told this story walking down the street. It was winter time. He was wearing a big furry hat. And an Austrian non-Jew came up, said something anti-Semitic, and knocked his hat off his head into the gutter in a very provocative fashion. And Freud said, well, what did you do? His father said, I picked up my hat. And from this, I think Freud does, and in a certain way what Boyarin argues, is that if you want to read Freud's theories, it's really about self-diagnosis. That Freud saw the Jewish man as, in a certain sense, weak. And that what he saw psychotherapy doing was curing the problems in the Jewish soul. And so, creating a new picture. Now, the notion of heterosexuality versus homosexuality really only appears in the late 19th century. And the idea of homosexuality is associated with men who have feminine aspects. And, right, if you look at traditional Jewish culture, right, what does a good Jewish wife do? They go out and they work hard so that the man can do what? Sit in the house and read, right? And so you've got, seemingly, right, he says if you look at traditional Christian culture, right, you get, there's a split between the priest and the knight. So they split the mind from the body. And the body, the knight, embodies romantic love, right? Whereas the priest is supposed to be celibate. So the mind becomes desexualized. The body hypersexualized, and hypersexualized connected with pure love, right? Think about all of our notions of love, right? A knight riding in on a white horse. Isn't that weird that we still have these remnants of this sort of Middle Ages picture, right? Whereas what did Jews do? A good man, a good husband, was a little smart weakling. A philosophy professor with a ponytail. Right? So the picture of masculinity and of attractive masculinity was very much the opposite of the traditional Christian picture. And what we see Freud doing is wrestling with these questions of sexuality at the same time as we're wrestling with questions of identity. And of trying to fit Jews back into the society, right? He's a modernist, trying to fit Jews back into the society in a way that they fit. And so one of the things that was keeping us from fitting in was that we had this alternative picture of masculinity. And so we needed Jewish men to become men. And the Israeli picture of men, and that's what he argues, in a certain sense, is that it really was Freud and the founding of the modern state of Israel that forced itself to militaristically defend itself that radically reshaped Jewish masculinity. And so that Freud played a part in that, even though he was himself a pacifist, but that there was this deep tension underneath. So yeah, it's a complicated but interesting story.
We can't wait until your book on Freud. Thank you so much.
I think there was, can we have one more? I'm sorry.
Of course. Apologies.
I enjoyed this very, very much.
Oh, thank you.
This isn't a question, but it's just a comment. I was surprised that you had included so much of Freud in your speech here. I am a descendant of Freud.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, my name is Freud.
Wow.
Yeah, he was apparently a third cousin of my grandfather, and my father was born in England in 1912.
Gracious.
And, so there is connection there. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Oh, I think we have...
One more question? No? Yes?
Please.
Let me just give you the microphone. That would be the last one, just because of my time.
It's actually two quick questions. There are many books out on Einstein, and I'm thinking Walter Isaacson's recent biography, which is quite authoritative.
Yes.
What inspired you to write this book? I mean, did you see a gap in the literature and so forth, and why this book at this time? Number two, the quest for a theory of everything is very big in cosmology today. This attempt to unify quantum mechanics with Einstein's theory of general relativity through things like string theory and so forth. What do you think Einstein would make of this? Would he be supportive of this move, or I mean, is this new science that's coming out in some sense discrediting his theory, or would he be complimentary toward it? What's your sense of that?
Okay, let me answer them in order. So the first part is the book. Isaacson's biography is a wonderful biography. The Clark biography, there are a number of wonderful biographies of Einstein. So the last thing I would want to do is set out to write another biography. This book did start, literally when my colleague came in talking about Jewish ethics. And my realization that there was this relationship in the structure of thought. My work is in the history and philosophy of physics. When I realized that there was this difference And so we just excitedly talk because we're Jews, that's what we do. And then, my work in the period looks not only at the theory, but also at sort of the social situation that gave rise to it. And the notion of Einstein's Jewish science. Oh my goodness, well, is it? I mean, it just seems such a provocative question. Could we take this, claim by, of all people, Aryan science, either Nazi party members or Nazi sympathizers, and say there's anything meaningful in there? It just seemed such an odd, interesting project. And so the two of us actually wrote a scholarly paper. And everywhere we presented it, whether it was to a scholarly audience or to a popular audience, people just got excited and wanted to talk about it and thought, wow, this needs to be expanded. And so the book doesn't only talk about Einstein's life, but also about the science that was happening at the time, about the history that gave rise to the social situation from which the theory gave. Now, when reading, I was actually working on this when Isaacson's book came out, and I read it, and it's a wonderful book, and there are points where I was getting nervous, because he was saying, okay, he's about to say it, he doesn't say it. And, one of Isaacson's technical advisors on the book actually was my dissertation director. So it's interesting that, Isaacson does hint at exactly the thesis that's in here. So, yeah, I mean, what I'm doing is clearly something different. I mean, there are biographical stories, as you can tell. I love the stories. But it's not a biography. It's a series of conversations about different, if we take this phrase Jewish science, what do we mean by it? Well, we could mean 6 different things. Well, if we mean it this way, is it? No. If we mean it this way, is it? Yeah. How about this way? Maybe. So I treat the question Jewishly, right? Let's look at it in terms of different interpretations. So it's an intellectual activity that's sort of different from a biographer's approach. Did I see a gap in the literature? I was just having fun. This is what I do. The second question is the theory of everything. Now, Einstein won the Nobel Prize not for the theory of relativity. The theory of relativity was still extremely controversial, and there was one member of the Nobel Committee who was determined that it was wrong. And Einstein was denied the Nobel Prize for years and years because this guy would not acknowledge. And so in 1921, there was actually no Nobel Prize given. 1922 comes around, and Max Planck, we come back to Planck, writes a letter to the committee saying, it is an embarrassment that Einstein has not gotten this prize. It actually looks bad for the prize that it hasn't gone to Einstein. Now, a lot of you probably know, the Nobel can only be given to people who are living. It cannot be given posthumously. And so they say, look, you never know what's going to happen when. It better go to Einstein sometime. And so in 1922, they agreed that they would give it, backdated to him in 21. But this guy, his name was Arrhenius, he only agreed if we say explicitly, and it says this on his prize, that it was for his contributions to quantum mechanics. Not relativity, we'll give it to him for this. Now, he wrote at a time, and in 1905, the same year he produces the paper that starts relativity theory, he actually puts out 4. One is his doctoral dissertation, which is on mixing. How much of this and this do I put in, and how long do I have to start until I get something uniform? One is relativity. One is a paper on what's called Brownian motion. If you take water and you stick it under a microscope and you look at the particles of dust in it, they dance in weird ways. He explained that, and that actually is what finally nailed down the existence of atoms. And the 4th is his paper on what's called the photoelectric effect. If you shine ultraviolet light, a black light, those of you who were around in the 60s, a black light on metal, it kicks off electrons. He explained that. And that explanation is what, in part, gave rise to quantum mechanics. So you've got 2 theories, his theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, which turn out to relativity talks about things that are big and fast. Quantum mechanics talk about things that are very small. And it turns out they don't work well together. Now, at Einstein's time, he thought relativity was great because it answered questions about almost everything, but not quite everything. And so he was trying to figure out a relativistic theory that would fold in the last few pieces. So Einstein himself spent his last several years working on a theory of everything. But it was a theory of everything that didn't account for quantum mechanics because he thought it was flawed in the direction it went. Now, others took on quantum mechanics and realized that quantum mechanics and relativity theory can't work together. Both of them, every single prediction they give you is absolutely right. Bizarre, weird, unexpected, right. But they can't both be true. So the hope is to come up with some way to bring those two theories together. That's what we're seeing in this search for the theory of everything. String theory is one approach. What would Einstein think? Well, Einstein was uneasy about quantum mechanics in general, so the idea of finding a relativistic relativity theory would bother him, and it did because he saw younger people around him trying to do it. He thought they couldn't be right. But the general impulse to unify was absolutely there in Einstein, and it was the project he was working on till the day he died. So the answer is a Jewish answer. Yes and no. I promise I will stay around as long as you have questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. I invite everyone to keep this conversation outside. We have the book for sale, so I encourage you to purchase it, and I'm sure Gimbel will sign them for you. So please feel free to ask him questions on a one-on-one basis and in the name of it. Thank you so much for coming. Have a great evening.